Hi, I'm Professor Mark Grabowski, and this video lecture will address researching your speeches. Not only will this video lecture assist you with researching speeches for my class, it will also be useful to you in the future whenever you have to do any other kind of speech. Because researching speeches is really key in writing a good speech. Careful research precedes writing a good speech, which of course precedes giving a good speech. And by providing good examples, by giving the audience strong evidence, and by citing credible sources, you can make your speech a lot more convincing and effective than it otherwise would be. So this video lecture will address evidence and sources of evidence. Specifically, we will cover why you need to use evidence and sources in your speeches, how many sources you should use in your speeches, what types of sources are available. There are many different types that you can use, where you can find sources, what makes a source credible, how to cite a source in your speech, and how to explain sources. Sometimes just saying that you found information on this website isn't enough. People might not be familiar with the website you're talking about, so you might have to explain a little bit about the website or about the person or source that you're citing. We'll get into that later on. Okay, so first things first, what is evidence? Evidence is information taken either from fact or opinion used to establish the probable truth of a claim. So in most of the speeches you're going to be giving, whether it's a persuasive speech or you're doing a debate, you're going to be making some sort of claim, i.e., we should be doing this, or we should not do that, or we should change this. All right, now anybody can have an opinion. Anyone can say whatever they want. But if you really want to convince people, if you want to seem like you know what you're talking about, if you want to prove that there's a good reason for what you're arguing, you need to go and back it up with evidence, with facts. This evidence helps support your claims. So, for example, you're arguing we should force people to wear bicycle helmets, and you go and back it up with the fact that last year 5,000 bicyclists who weren't wearing helmets suffered concussions. If they had been wearing helmets, they could have prevented those injuries. That's a fact. It supports your claim, and it makes your claim a lot stronger. It's also going to give you credibility. So, you're not, like I said, anyone could have an opinion, but it's the smart people who go and back it up with good logic, good reason, good statistics. And as a result, when you offer the audience these facts, these statistics, this evidence, you cite credible sources, scientific studies, things like that, your audience is more likely to believe you. So it's important that in all of your speeches, regardless of the type of speech you're giving, you include evidence and you cite the sources of that evidence. Now, there are a lot of different types of evidence that you can use in your speeches. You can use examples and illustrations. You can use statistics. You can use artifacts. You can use premises. You can use scientific evidence. And you can use opinions. Let me explain each briefly. Examples and illustrations describe or report events, phenomena that exist. Examples are brief statements. Illustrations are more detailed accounts. Statistics numerically represent information about people, events, and phenomena. They may be expressed in raw numbers or summarized in percentages or averages. Artifacts are actual exhibits of such things as objects, audio tapes and videotapes, photographs, and diagrams. Premises are factual claims that exist as evidence on the basis of their being accepted as reflections of human belief or experience. So in other words, these are rules of wisdom such as monkey see, monkey do, or what goes up must come down. And finally, scientific evidence reports the results of field and laboratory experiments on the effect of one variable on another. So how many sources should you use in a speech? Well, it's going to vary depending on your situation and your professor, but for this class, for my class, you must have at least 3 different sources for each speech, and that's regardless of whether you're doing persuasive speech, which is only 2 minutes long, or the group project, which is going to be much, much longer than 2 minutes. You need to have a minimum of 3 sources, and you must properly cite your sources in both your speech and your outline, otherwise you will lose points. And later on in this video I will explain how to properly cite sources. So where can you find sources? Now of course I realize that a lot of you are in the habit of using the internet and specifically search engines like Google to find information for your papers and speeches, but you need to be really careful with this because Google's not always the best source of information. Studies have shown that Google contains only a fraction, perhaps, at best 1/16 of all the information that's out there on a topic, and the information you find might not even be the best information. Google uses a special formula to determine how to rank pages on its website, and consequently some of the pages that come up first for certain topics aren't necessarily the most informative or authoritative on the topic. They simply happen to meet the criteria of Google's algorithm, or perhaps the website even hired someone who's familiar with search engine optimization, and as a result, because they repeat the same word over and over, or because they have the word in their domain name, they pop up high in the results. But in fact, there may be sort of obscure, not well-known websites that are like the 10,000th result for the key term you're looking for, that may be much more informative. So be really careful if you use Google. That should just be a starting point. And you need to go well beyond the first 10 hits, the first 100 hits, even the first 1,000 hits that you find in the Google search engine. The best thing to do is just do some good old-fashioned research. Visit the local library, the campus library, and ask a librarian for help. They've got all kinds of databases, resources, books, journals, specifically addressing the topics you'll be speaking on, and you'll need to research for your speeches. Remember, opinions are also a form of evidence, so you can also go out and interview experts on your topics, things like professors, staff, even students. It all depends on what sort of topic you're researching. If, for example, you're doing a speech on the past presidential election, an expert source might be a professor of political science. However, just talking to some random student you meet at the student center and citing them probably wouldn't be a good source. On the other hand, if you're doing a speech on fraternities and sororities and Greek life on campus, and whether the college should allow Greek life, then it might make sense to talk to to a student, to actually talk to the president of a fraternity and get some information from him. For a speech like that, for a topic like that, a student could in fact be an expert source. You need to ask yourself, well, how do they have any specialized knowledge on this topic? How do they know what they know? Would most people consider this person to be an expert on the source? And if the answer for all of those questions is yes, then you may want to consider using that person as a source and citing their expert opinion as a quotation in your speech. And another handy resource is LexisNexis, and this is an electronic database. You can access it online through the college's website, and you will be able to find a number of credible sources through here. And I think this will be a lot more useful for you than just using Google. So let me explain how LexisNexis works. So the first thing you want to do is open up your web browser, and in the navigation bar type in library.marist.edu. After you type that in, the library's homepage will pop up. So that's the direct URL for the library. You could also go to marist.edu and navigate around there and look for the library link, but it's just easier if you go directly to the library's website. That's library.marist.edu. Once you're there, do you see that red bar at the top of the page above James A. Canavino Library? Well, you want to click on Research, and then you want to scroll down and you want to select Databases. After you select that, two options will pop up: by subject or by A to Z list. Click on by A to Z list. So just to reiterate, you're going to the library's homepage, library.marist.edu. You're going to click on Research in that top red area, and then you're going to select Databases, and then you're going to select by A to Z list. So that's going to take you to a new page, which is going to list all of the databases that the Marist Library has access to in alphabetical order. You want to go and either scroll down to the databases that begin with the letter L, or just click on the letter L. If you can see above the databases listed, they have that they have those letters there. You want to click on the L letter, and after you do that, you will scroll down. It will take you to the databases listed by L. You want to click on LexisNexis. That's LexisNexis. You will then be prompted to log in. So you'll want to list the your account and password information that you normally use for the to access services on Marist online network. So type in your account and your password, and then click login, and then you will be logged into LexisNexis. So what you want to do is, do you see that box in the middle of the screen where next to it says search terms? Well, that's where you will type in your topic, what you're searching for. So for example, if your topic is mandatory bicycle helmets, you want to go and you'll type in something like bicycle helmets and mandatory. Remember that this I think database normally uses just sort of connectors in terms when you're searching for items, so you can't sort of just type in natural language like you would into Google. So instead you want to just type in key terms such as bicycle helmets or bicycle and helmets and mandatory, and use those connectors like and or. And also note that you can search within all kinds of different databases. So you can search within major US and world publications, or you could just search within web publications or news wire services, or a combination of things. You can also specify the date within like the past 2 years or 5 years or something like that. I recommend it, searching within the past 2 years, certainly not much beyond the past 5 years, because when you get beyond that point, the information is old, and on some of these topics, the information is changing all the time. So even using information that's a few years old may be outdated. Alright, so just to show you as an example, I did a search for bicycle helmets and mandatory using major US and world publications within the past 2 years. As you can see, dozens of results appeared. This is just in the past 2 years. For a lot of these topics, you may find hundreds of results. So you'll have to read through these, and some information will be better than others, or more compelling than others. Remember, you want to use the best information, not necessarily just the first 3 results you find. You want to go and sort through this and prioritize and use the best pieces of information you find in your speeches. But this will be a lot more effective than just doing a search on Google. You'll find a lot better sources, more relevant information, and more credible information doing a search through LexisNexis. And before you use any source, whether it's something you find on Google, in a book, on Lexis, or in the New York Times, you want to ask yourself, basically, is the information believable? And you can determine that by asking yourself 3 basic questions. First, is the source of information objective or biased? To be objective is to be free from prejudgments and bias. A biased information source may show a preference for one side. Many students debating the reform of marijuana laws, for example, turn to the website of NORML, or the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws. NORML is an advocacy group working, in their own words, to quote, reform marijuana laws, end quote. Much of the information at their website is selected to reinforce their position that marijuana should be legalized or decriminalized. So that wouldn't be an objective source. Instead, you might try sources ranging from the New England Journal of Medicine to Science News to the science section of the New York Times. These sources have no interest in the outcome of policy debates over marijuana, unlike NORML, and they would most likely be able to offer objective and unbiased information. The second question you want to ask is, what is the relative expertise of the author or reporter? How did they know what they claim to know? Do they have first-hand knowledge? Were they in the place where the events they report on took place? One of the ways it was discovered that Jason Blair plagiarized stories he wrote for the generally respected New York Times is that no travel records to the place he was supposed to have been were discovered. Later it was discovered that he never talked to people in those locations. So being there matters. Besides first-hand knowledge, specialized knowledge on the subject is important. Who would you trust more to give you advice about surgery? A doctor with a PhD in communication, or an MD with extensive surgical experience? You'd trust the MD with extensive surgical experience, of course, right? So just because somebody has a fancy title doesn't necessarily mean that they are an expert. So you really need to give that some thought. Ask yourself, how does this source know what he or she claims to know? Finally, you need to consider the currency of the information. That is, how recent is the information? Unless it is being used to give historic context, a news report about Iraqi politics from 1984 would shine little light about the current situation, because the regime that was in power, Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist Party, no longer rules the country. News reports about Iraqi politics since that regime changed would be much more valuable. So you should only believe those sources of information when the source is objective, where the author or reporter has relevant experience, and when the information is relevant and up to date. So going back to the types of evidence you can use, you need to consider these three factors that I just mentioned. So for example, with statistics, just because you have a statistic doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. I mean, what's that saying? There are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. Be really careful, because you'll see these days a lot of online polls where websites will conduct surveys, and people who are reading the website can click yes or no, or on any number of multiple choice options. And those aren't scientific polls, because you could conceivably have the same person clicking the same answer over and over and skewing the results of the poll. So if you use statistics, if you're using a poll, for example, you want to make sure that it was done scientifically. Gallup is an organization that's known for doing credible scientific polls. However, if you just see a poll on a random website, or even CNN.com, a lot of them use these web-based polls that I just mentioned, and they are not scientific polls. Anyone reading the website can respond to them, and sometimes the same person will respond multiple times. Similarly, with scientific evidence, just because something is done in a scientific journal doesn't necessarily mean that it's great information to use. For example, if you are giving a speech about the dangers of the product and a test revealed that it was dangerous, you want to look into that test further. Was the product actually tested on humans, or was it just tested on mice? You might have completely different results if you test a product on mice than you would if you tested on humans. So you need to be cautious of things like that. A few more tips on determining whether a source is acceptable or not. Wikipedia is not an acceptable source, and the reason for that is that it is a website that is that the public is allowed to edit. So basically, anyone can go in and change anything about any article on Wikipedia, and people do that. Sometimes you get pranksters who will go into politicians' websites and write all sorts of defamatory things or untrue things about them, just as a joke. And if you happen to be, a student in third grade doing a research paper on, that politician that day, well, you'd be in trouble because you'd have that bad information there. It might end up in your paper, and your teacher would see it and be like, this is not true at all. So never use Wikipedia as a source in this class or in any other class. It's fine to go to Wikipedia just to get some general background information. A lot of times the articles on Wikipedia will link to credible sources, and you can go to those actual sources and perhaps cite information from them, if they're an article from the New York Times or something like that. But don't actually ever use information on Wikipedia and cite it in a speech. Also, be careful. Personal homepages and blogs are not acceptable. A lot of times you'll see people go and create websites to pay homage to their hobbies or their favorite actor or something like that. And a lot of these people have never actually personally met the people they're doing their websites about, and that is not reliable information. So don't go and cite personal homepages and blogs by just random anonymous bloggers in your speeches. Now, if it's a blog on the New York Times that's maintained by a staff writer, that might be a legitimate source. But a blog just by some random person is not going to be an acceptable source. Again, it goes back to those series of questions I mentioned. You need to ask yourself, well, who's behind this source? How do they know the information they know? Is the information current? Things like that. And if you do that, that will eliminate a lot of blogs from being used as sources in your speeches. Another thing you need to be careful of is just because a domain, a website ends in .org does not make it a good source. Okay, anybody can register for a .org. They don't have to be an organization or a credible individual or anything like that. Wikipedia is a .org, so don't be fooled by that if you see that in a domain name. And also keep in mind that some sources may look good but really aren't when you take a closer look. There are some websites that have like official sounding names, or they have a very attractive website, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're good sources of information and that you can trust them. For example, you have the White House's official website, whitehouse.gov. All right, this is a credible source. This is maintained by the White House, by the president's staff. Although some people might actually say, actually, this isn't that credible of a source, considering that the White House used to, when Bush was in office, post information about WMDs in Iraq, and of course it turned out there were none. But generally, information on government websites that end with .gov, are credible. Generally, like I said, you still got to ask yourself those same series of questions and always be skeptical. All right, now let's take a look at this website, whitehouse.org. So you had whitehouse.gov, which was the official website of the White House. Now we're looking at whitehouse.org. At first glance, this looks pretty official. You might even confuse it with the official website of the White House, of the president. But take a closer look at the website. You'll see it's actually a parody. It's not serious information. So even though it has an official sounding name, even though it looks official, it's in fact not a credible website. It's supposed to be a joke. So you need to be careful, because a lot of websites will go and use official sounding words in their domain names like White House, or they may use a .org, but that doesn't mean they're good sources. Okay, here's another example. This is the White House Writers Group. So sounds very official, right? This is the White House Writers Group, the writers for the White House, right? The speechwriters. Actually, no, it's some private consulting firm. They again have an attractive looking website, looks very official. They've got this official name, but it has actually nothing to do with the White House. They don't work for the White House. They're not paid by the government. This is a private consulting company. So be really careful with websites and website names. In one of my previous classes, when we did our persuasive speeches and our debates, a lot of students took information from a website called balancedpolitics.org. You can go and check it out in your browser. That's balancedpolitics, one word, .org. All right, it sounds very official, right? And if you read the about section of the website, it says that it covers the pros and cons of important topics from a nonpartisan standpoint. Oh, okay, so they're objective, they're biased, right? But take a closer look. You'll see that they don't actually cite their sources of information, so you have no idea where their information is coming from. There's only vague information in the about part of the website. You don't know who's actually behind the website, which person runs it, whether they go and do any sort of fact checking on the information that's posted there. So this would not be a good source to use in your speeches. Avoid using this source. If you use balancedpolitics.org, I will go and deduct points from your speech because it's not a credible website. Another piece of advice is to make sure that your source is objective. So here up on the screen, I've taken a screenshot of a web page from Thomas Cooley's law school. And generally websites in academia, universities and colleges and law schools, websites are pretty good sources. It's usually a safe bet that you're going to find good, credible information on there, but that's not always the case. All right, take a look at this page here. Like I said, it's on a law school's website. Basically, what we have here is this law school went and concocted their own law school rankings. So Thomas Cooley is not really a well-respected law school. It's regarded as one of the sort of weaker law schools in the country by a lot of people in the legal community, and I guess they were upset with constantly ranking poorly in the U.S. News and World Report. So they decided to come up with their own rankings using their own criteria, and of course, the rankings were manipulated in such a way that they came out favorably in these rankings. So in this ranking, in their own rankings, they have themselves ranked number 12. In the U.S. News and World Report rankings, they're not even probably in the top 200. But here in their own rankings, they're number 12. Ranked up with such esteemed law schools as Georgetown and Harvard and Yale. So normally .edu websites, websites of colleges and universities are credible sources, but again, you need to be skeptical of everything. You need to ask yourself those series of questions I discussed. Who's the source of information? How do they know what they know? In this case, Thomas Cooley is the one, the law school is the one that's deemed itself to be one of the best law schools in the country. So not an objective source of information, very biased. This would not be a credible source. Okay, here are a few more tips for establishing the credibility of your sources. Make sure your expert sources are credible. Generally, a person with a professional title such as doctor, director, attorney, etc. is more persuasive than a person without one. A well-known magazine, newspaper, or broadcast station such as Time, CNN, The Washington Post is more persuasive than an unknown one. Make sure that any expert or so-called expert information that you get online is credible. Many websites are just forums for personal opinions and are not factually reliable. To be on the safe side, try to use only official websites as evidence as much as possible. And make sure your evidence is relevant to your subject. You do not want to use information about sleep apnea, for example, if your subject is about acne, unless sleep apnea somehow causes acne. Okay, so now let's talk about how you cite sources in your outlines and in your speeches. First, let's talk about how to properly cite sources in your outlines. Remember, your sources should be cited in some sort of standard academic citation format, either APA, MLA, or Chicago. So if you just go and list the URL, the website address of your information, of your source, that's not going to be acceptable. All right, that doesn't tell me anything about the source. I don't know what's on that web page. That's why I require you to cite your sources in proper APA and MLA format, because that will ensure that you go and give me information about your source, especially if it's an online source, that will tell me a little bit about it, so I have some idea what the source is about, where it came from. So for example, I have on the screen an article I found on the New York Times about Obama's stimulus plan, and I have a wrong way to cite it, which I often see in student outlines. All right, if you cite it like that, if you cite just the URL, you'll lose points. You need to cite it correctly, and I have a correct way to cite it. You see, you have the reporter's name, then you have the date, then you have the title of the article, then you have the source of the article, the New York Times, and then you have the location where you got it from on the web. And if you're unsure how to put something in APA format, you can just, usually most English grammar books will explain, English writing books will explain citation formats, or you can just go online, either Google APA format, or type into your browser www.citationmachine.net, and all you do is just plug in the information about your source, the author's name, the title, the date, things like that, and it will format your information so that it is in APA format. So that's www.citationmachine.net, or you can just Google APA format, and that will list a number of websites that will explain how to list a source in APA format. Now, as I mentioned, you also need to cite the sources of your information in your speeches. All right, and there are wrong ways to do this, and there are correct ways to do this. If you go and, for example, find an article in the newspaper, say it's in the New York Times, and it reports on a new Gallup poll that came out that found that 75% of Americans oppose the death penalty. All right, well, what would the source of your information be? Would it be the New York Times? No, the New York Times only reported on the information. The source of your information would actually be Gallup. They're the ones who conducted the survey. Okay, the New York Times didn't conduct the survey. Gallup conducted the survey. So how would you cite this? Well, you wouldn't cite it like this. You would not say, according to a recent study, 75% of Americans oppose the death penalty. Why is that wrong? I mean, it was a recent study after all, right? And 75% did oppose the death penalty. Well, because that doesn't tell us anything about the study. It doesn't tell us anything about the source of the study. So you can't just, use anonymous sources like that. You need to say whose study it was. And as I mentioned, it would be wrong to say, according to the New York Times, most Americans oppose the death penalty. The New York Times is only the messenger here. They're relaying the information from Gallup, so that would be inaccurate also. The correct way to cite the information would be to say, according to a 2008 Gallup poll, 75% of Americans surveyed support the death penalty. So this way, you're listing the source. You're telling the audience that it is new recent information, because you have that 2008 in there, and then you have the information itself. If you want to be super cautious, if you have any sort of doubt about the credibility of the New York Times, or you're afraid maybe we got another Jason Blair here, a dishonest reporter, maybe he didn't report the information accurately, then what you might say is, the New York Times reports that according to a 2008 Gallup poll, 75% of Americans support the death penalty. So, you have the source, the Gallup poll, you have the year 2008, so the audience knows it's relevant, and you also have the source in case if people are like, well, I looked on the Gallup poll's website, I didn't see that survey, or I saw that survey in another paper and it said only 50% support the death penalty. This way you're explaining where you saw the information. So that's just if you want to be super cautious. But like I said, the actual source for this information would be the Gallup poll, not the New York Times. So you want to cite the Gallup poll, and you need to cite, at least the year of the survey so that we know it's relevant. I mean, if this is a survey from 1999, well, people's views might have changed significantly since then. So using a survey from 1999 would not be a good source. Now, last semester, a lot of students like to take information from a website known as procon.org, and I checked out the website, and it looks like it's actually a legitimate website. It has some good information on there. The problem is that it doesn't have its own information, okay? All it does is cite information from other sources. So if you're going, as many students did, and crediting procon.org, you're not giving credit where credit's due. You need to go and make sure you give credit to the appropriate sources, to the actual sources of information. All right, procon.org is just a website that hosts information from different sources. It's not the actual source of information. The same thing with Google. Google is a search engine. You use it to find information, but it's not a source of information itself. So if you're doing a speech on, say, that Americans should have the right to die, they should have the right to assisted suicide, you'll see procon.org has that topic covered, as they do many other topics. But it would be incorrect to say, according to procon.org, people have a legal right to die in America. All right, that's not according to procon.org. That's actually according to Neil Gorsuch, who is the Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice, and he wrote that in his 2000 article, The Right to Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia, that appeared in the Harvard Journal and Law and Public Policy. All right, that information, a snippet of that information is posted on procon.org, but procon.org is not the source. Rather, Neil Gorsuch is, and the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. So that's who you need to cite, not procon.org. In many cases, you may need to also explain your sources. Just giving us the name of your source may not be accurate enough, or may not tell the audience enough about the source to determine whether it's legitimate or not. This is especially true when it comes to websites for the media. For example, the Providence Journal posts their stories online, but its website's called projo.com. Now, if you're in Providence, most people know projo.com. That's the Providence Journal's website. But if you're outside of Providence, you probably don't know that. So if you hear projo.com, you'll be like, well, what's that? So instead, you want to say the Providence Journal, because that's the actual source of the information. Projo.com is just the URL for their website. Similarly, the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Philadelphia Daily News, the two major daily newspapers in Philadelphia, post their stories on Philly.com. So if you're citing information from Philly.com, you need to determine whether it came from the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Philadelphia Daily News, and you want to cite one or the other, not Philly.com. SFgate.com is another one. That's the official website of the San Francisco Chronicle. A lot of people outside of the Bay Area don't know that, so don't say sfgate.com, cite the San Francisco Chronicle, because they're the ones who actually wrote the story. The story came from a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, and it appeared not only in the newspaper but also on their website, so cite the San Francisco Chronicle. And the same applies to organizations as well as the media. For example, it's not cancer.org. It's the American Cancer Society. Cancer.org is just the website or the domain name for the American Cancer Society. So if you're getting information from cancer.org, well, that came from the American Cancer Society. So you need to explain, you need to cite the American Cancer Society. If you want to be super precise, then you can say the website of the American Cancer Society, but don't say cancer.org. Similarly, uh, it's not ed.gov, it's the US Department of Education. All right, ed.gov is their website, so if you got information at ed.gov, you would cite the US Department of Education. And the same goes for academic websites. It wouldn't be marist.edu, it would be Marist College or Marist College's website. It wouldn't be harvard.edu, it would be Harvard University or the website of Harvard University. And beyond that, you may need to also explain your sources. Everyone knows popular media outlets like the New York Times and CNN, federal agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation or FBI, large nonprofit organizations like the American Red Cross, and famous people like Bill Gates, Abraham Lincoln, and Michael Jordan. But unless you're living under a rock, you're going to know who all these people are. So you can just name really famous sources, people, places, things like this, and you don't have to qualify them further. However, a lot of your sources that you're going to use for your speeches are not going to be household names. Most of your classmates won't recognize them. Most people in your audience will never have heard of your sources. So, for example, what if you're using the Brookings Institution? All right, it's a well-respected research think tank in Washington, D.C., and certainly I would consider it a credible source, but most people aren't familiar with Brookings Institution, so you'd want to go and give a little bit information about them, who they are and what they do. Same thing with Cornel West. Have you heard of Cornel West? Hopefully you have, okay? He's kind of the preeminent scholar on race relations. He's a professor, I think he's at Princeton now, or maybe he's at Harvard. He's switched back and forth from one to the other. At any rate, a lot of people have not heard of him, so you wouldn't want to just say Professor Cornel West. You'd want to go and tell us a little bit about him. You'd want to say Professor Cornel West, a Harvard University scholar who is considered the preeminent expert on race relations in America. What about BNet? Have you heard of them? Or Portfolio Media? What about the Yomiuri Shimbun? That's actually the largest newspaper in the world, but because it's based in Japan, most Americans are not familiar with it. So if you're outside of Japan and you're citing the Yomiuri Shimbun, you would need to tell us a little bit about it. You would need to say it's a Tokyo-based newspaper that's the world's largest newspaper. Same thing with the Circle. If you're giving a speech at Marist and you cite the Circle, that's fine. But if you're giving a speech outside of Marist College, you'd need to explain that the Circle is the student newspaper of Marist College, because practically no one outside of Marist College is going to understand who or what the Circle is. You need to ask yourself these questions about your source. Would everyone in my audience recognize this source? And if not, you need to explain the source. You need to tell us a little bit about who they are, what they do that makes them significant, that makes them an expert, that makes them a credible source. All right, if you fail to explain your sources and they're not household names, I will deduct points. So make sure you explain your sources if they need to be explained. So that concludes today's presentation on using evidence and sources in your speeches. As always, if you have any questions, email me at mark.grabowski@marist.edu. That's mark.grabowski@marist.edu. Remember, don't guess or assume. Ignorance is not an acceptable excuse. So if you use a bad source and I tell you after your speech, hey, that wasn't a credible source, or what source is this? Don't say, oh, I just assumed everyone knew what it was, or I assumed it was a good source. Ask me ahead of time if you have any doubt about the credibility of your sources, okay? Send me an email, be like, is this a good source? And I'll let you know, or go and talk to a librarian.